long production day, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, all you Patreon lovelies. Patreon.com/music is not a genre. Thank you for being a part of the family. And as one of those thank yous, this is the Bonus MxTRA for Season 8, Episode 20. And as promised, it is the rise of the digital audio workstation and the home studio. And in fact, is a complete history of it. So I'm going to get right to it, except to say that I've been recording for a while here today. I batch cook these, as I've mentioned before, and this is the first segment where my dog Olga has finally settled down, which is why I'm also sounding a little calmer, perhaps, than I did in the main episode. Although I am always a little calmer in these because I'm talking intimately to you, my lovely family at Patreon. So, first section here, we'll call Before the Shift. Recording used to mean booking time in a studio, spending a lot of money, and only being able to do it if someone maybe financed you to do it, or you're signed to a label and stuff like that and could afford it and could continue to do it and could continue to make money to do it, etc. Engineers and producers were often separate roles from artists, and they still are, but the change was coming throughout the decades. The studio was a destination, not a default. Why Me Studios? Joe DeLuca was my favorite destination for that work in the 90s. Artist making a record required permission, financial or institutional. That's the bottom line. The next thing is the laptop becomes the studio. So DAWs centralized everything. And this is all sort of a preface to my complete history of digital audio workstations. This is laying kind of the timeline here from the 80s and 90s and before up until what was happening in the 2000s. Recording, editing, arranging, and mixing, and mastering, if you know how to do it, could all happen in DAWs. And from now on, I'm not going to say digital audio workstation. I'm going to say DAWs. Okay. For those of you who do not know what they are, well, you're still interested enough to be here to listen to this. I'll quickly say that they're exactly what it sounds like. It's software that lays grids out, that allows you to see the tracks that you were recording, either horizontally or vertically. Vertically more for mixing and things like that. Horizontally, you can do everything, mixing, recording, etc., automation of certain things that replaces or works alongside of the analog physical faders, the mixing board, etc. You don't need that unless you want it, essentially. That's why they call it mixing in the box. You don't need any outboard gear when you have a digital audio workstation. You can record anything your heart dreams of if you have the, capability of doing that with a DAW. And there are free DAWs out there that I'll mention, and others that are inexpensive, etc. Interfaces and mics become affordable. I can't do my other job, which is voiceover artist, voice actor for commercials and things, without my interface. And the interface is a little box that has plugins for mics and instruments that then goes through a MIDI, which is a USB cable, I should say. USB cable, not a MIDI cable, geez. Into the computer, and that becomes your audio interface. It is your audio interface. You have a headphone jack, you have outs for speakers if you want to monitor, etc. That's how you record everything. MIDI and virtual instruments replace or supplement physical gear. Talked about that in the main episode. VSTs and other plug-in type things are just mini pieces of software that you slide onto tracks in the DAW that help you do whatever you want to do with them. EQ for the bottom, middle, top range. Add reverb, add delay, add chorus, add flange, add distortion. All of the guitars I do, I don't use pedals anymore. I have such an amazing array of plugins for distortion. And I know how to make my guitars sound like they're being played live anyway, that I don't need the gear. All right. So next, control changes the creative process. So the heart of this episode here, this bonus, is that you could evolve a song over time instead of being finished in the session, because you had ultimate control over everything, and you had access to the mix anytime you wanted. You didn't have to go. I just walk into the next room to my computer station, and that's where I do all my recording and mixing and mastering, which meant you didn't have to pay money for studio time, and you could experiment like crazy. Can be a bad thing for people who need the restrictions, but if you know what you're doing and you can breathe, it gives you space to reach heights you never thought you could. The fact that you could take something in a DAW that you liked from like the second minute and move it to the first minute, or whatever, like repeat a chorus, repeat one line of vocal, repeat a guitar riff, whatever, and not have to play it consistently and amazingly 50 times or however many times it repeats, is one of the things that enables me to make my music so good without taking weeks and months. And it's still authentic. Dispute me on that if you want. Tech actually shaped music because you could allow for an amazing amount of layering. I believe the most layers I've ever had, the most tracks, the DAW was upwards of 50. Some of that was doubling things, but it was something like that. And I guarantee you there are people out there who've used 75, 100 or something like that. Also more precision. You can quantize, meaning lock things into a beat. If you wanted something to be right on the quarter note, it could be, and the whole track could be. Tune things, whether it was auto-tune or whatever, you or even just slight pitch correction within a certain section of that wave file, that track. This allows you to, man, I love how I sang that, but my one note was slightly off. Just fix that one note. Not a big deal. And that all this allowed for more genre blending. As I said in the main episode, you could mix genres at will because you had access to everything. Okay. And then the trade-off here is that you had the infinite options, but as I said in the main episode, that could drive you crazy because you could mix yourself into the grave as opposed to just saying, it's good enough, it's done, right? The perfection tools, I have a difference of opinion with some of the other people I work with who believe that everything needs to be 1,000% on pitch and 1,000% quantized, where I'm, let's say 100, I hate that term anyway, 100% in each case, whereas I kind of prefer in the 90 to 95% range for pitch because little variations are very, the blue note, as they say. And about the same for quantization, which is certain things I prefer to be perfectly quantized, and others I need the feel there. Also, trade-off, isolation, meaning I do everything myself in this room, which makes it super freaking easy, and I don't have to worry about scheduling time or spending money or who else's schedule I have to deal with. But at the same time, you're missing spontaneous moments and interaction and other things that might happen when you're either A, in a different setting or with other people. So there's trade-offs, of course. And the thing is, no matter what you want to say, the home studio didn't take the place of other studios. It just has made it possible for any of us to do what our heart's desire is without having to worry about or wait for the ability to do it elsewhere, whatever that might mean. And guess what? Yes, that's affected studios across the board over the years, and yet there are some studios in this city and outside of the city that I know exist and still do good business, not just despite the DAWs, but because of them. Because then they could guarantee they're using a DAW. The studios I've been in recently, there's one in Brooklyn in particular, Cowboy, I believe, uses a DAW. I don't know which DAW it uses. I forget. It probably uses Logic. I don't know. But whether it's Logic, Ableton, what have you, then the guy I worked with in there, his band, he'd take the mix home and work on it and take it back to the studio, etc. So the studio still serves a purpose, and it's in part because it's able to adapt to DAWs. Okay, so now let's get into the history of DAWs, which is exciting. And of course, it goes back further than you would think. No, DAWs were not invented in the 2000s. The 1970s and 80s laid the foundations for DAWs. It was before DAWs were DAWs. One of the earliest digital recording systems in the late 70s was called SoundStream. It was used for classical recordings and research, and it ran on custom hardware, not computers, so a little different. It introduced the idea of, though, non-tape-based recording. So one of the first things, if not the first, where prior to that and certainly subsequent to that for many years, and still to this day to some degree, you could record things on tape. It would be the equivalent of recording, making a film on actual film reels, or shooting still photographs with actual, with a camera that was non-digital, like let's say a Polaroid or something like that. This SoundStream is the first thing really, or one of them, that enabled people to record things not using tape at all. Yet it was built on analog multi-track tape. It just that it introduced initially the ideas of digital audio recording, and most importantly here, and also, or whatever, editing. Heading into the late 70s and into the early 80s, the Fairlight CMI was a revolutionary hybrid system. It was a sampler. It was a sequencer. It was an editor. And it was the template for some things I'm going to mention later. One of the first all-in-one music computers. It was a standalone. And it allowed for what? Waveform editing on a screen. That's the huge development right here. When I think of my songs, I often just see the waveforms on the screen with the tracks. And what I love about that is that so much of my creative work is done by manipulating those waveforms. And this Fairlight, that's what it allowed us to do. So pioneering. Peter Gabriel, Kate Bush used it, among others. It had digital synthesis and sampling like never before. And introducing something. People talk about synesthesia. I don't have that, but I do often think of music visually, and it's in large part because these DAWs allow for visual audio editing, and this Fairlight was like one of the first ones, if not the first, and it changed workflows to allow for copying, pasting, things like that. The Synclavier, 1980s, is a high-end digital production system. Extremely powerful, extremely expensive as well. I got to see one once in the studio way back. It was great. I didn't need to use it, but it was great. Integrated sequencing, synthesis, and recording. So it was a synthesizer, but you could sequence on it and record on it. Again, this comes into play a little later on here. I'll mention it. It was used often in film scoring and pop production. It was built on the Fairlight ideas, of course. But it introduced a deep integration of the synthesizer and the sequencer, and allowing you to record that and create songs from it. And guess what? It's coming up. And it's coming up now. Synths of this era had these onboard sequencers, and this era meaning later on in the 80s and in the early 90s. They were basically streamlined, limited DAWs on board of a synth. Two examples here that I'm most familiar with because I owned and used them extensively in my early production work are the Ensoniq ESQ1, which had an onboard sequencing system. So it had that early form of thinking like a DAW, allowing you to use the synth and record and sequence before all this stuff transferred to computers. During, too, as well. It was a self-contained composition environment which allowed you to do the synth, the sequencing, and the performance live all in one instrument, which I would then take and pipe out, ironically, to a 4-track, because that was the way I was recording at the time, but I could create the entire set of tracks within that keyboard. It allowed users to build multi-part arrangements with MIDI control, so you mess up one note, change that one note through MIDI. Revolutionary. Effectively turning the keyboard into a hardware workstation for songwriting. Yes, it was. Yes. It's certainly limited compared to later DAWs, right? You couldn't edit the waveform like you could on that one earlier, and then certainly all the ones later. The visual interface was, I don't think I could use it now because it was so small and hard to see, but it introduced the idea that music could be constructed step by step inside a programmable system. rather than just performing and recorded or along with performing and recording. And the other one I'm very familiar with is the Corgo 1W Pro, which was an advancement on that in Sonic. This is the early 90s. It pushed it further, integrating multi-timbral sound engines, effects processing, which couldn't really do on the ESQ1, and more advanced sequencing, a better interface too. It was, again, pre-computer DAW right on the keyboard itself. There were so many songs that I was developing at that time that I wouldn't have been able to without the Corgo 1W Pro, which was originally my dad's keyboard until he got a new one and gave it to me. The workflow emphasized pattern-based composition and linear sequencing. So if I was doing my techno stuff, let's say, I can play something and then copy and paste it. It directly anticipated how later DAWs would handle tracks and arrangements, just didn't have the visuals. Getting in again to the late 80s and into the 90s, that's when the first true DAWs came about. So all this stuff before were ideas that would be fed into DAWs, but they weren't DAWs themselves. So you had Sound Tools, which in 89, which became Pro Tools in 91, which, believe it or not, after almost 40 years, is still the industry standard. First is best is usually not true. In this case, for many people, yes, it is. It was developed by DigiDesign, which later became Avid. It brought multi-track digital audio to computers. Early versions required dedicated hardware because the computer couldn't handle it, obviously. At that time, computers could barely handle anything except word processing. They were like glorified word processors. It was built on kind of the studio tape workflows the same way those early ones were, but it introduced non-linear editing. You could cut, copy, paste, and that was huge. That's really one of the things that makes DAWs so amazing. Session-based workflows, yes. Editing audio became like editing text. So, right, you can copy and paste text. Now you can do it with audio files. Right around that time, also, Cubase originally was MIDI sequencing software for Atari and PC, and then it added audio recording. It was very important in early electronic music production. It was built on the hardware sequencers, but it introduced MIDI-based composition environment and timeline-based arranging, which is a huge thing for DAWs. And I can't tell you how many people mentioned Cubase back then, those who could afford it. In the early 90s, something came about called Logic. Something I used to have a lot of experience with, but stopped using after I jumped into Ableton. It was originally called Notator Logic. It had strong MIDI sequencing roots. MIDI was such a big part of the development of DAWs early on, especially, and MIDI is still a part of DAWs today. I don't use it that much except for my keyboard interface. I have a little mini one that sits on the desk where if I want to play a synth part, I can play it there when it's just one line or something, as opposed to if I want something more elaborate, then I just use my, the USB up my digital piano. It was built on Cubase style MIDI workflows. Later added audio and virtual instruments, which is one of the big things that makes a DAW again so good, is that it has those instruments in there. It introduced more advanced composition tools, deep arrangement and notation integration, and of course Logic later became Logic Pro. Later in the 90s, or starting there, but then developing, they became real studios. You had Digital Performer, which debuted in 1990, which was created by Motu, Mark of the Unicorn, and the people I knew often just said Motu, as opposed to Digital Performer. It had a strong MIDI and audio hybrid system, something that's essential for me, being able to do those manufactured sounds, the synths and the plugins, with being able to play live instruments and sing. It's very popular in film scoring, by the way. Sequencer first. That was really where it came. It had a very tight sync between MIDI and audio, which lag is something that all of us in the audio world have dealt with, especially when you're, transmitting across miles. Anything that could reduce lag based on computer performance, whatever, huge. And later in the 90s, you had Acid Pro, which was a loose loop-based DAW from Sonic Foundry, later owned by Sony. Revolutionized beat-making simplicity, and it really, to me, kind of prefaced Fruity Loops. When you think of something, and to a degree Ableton, although not quite, but really Fruity Loops. Any type of music that uses loops, which now is, I think, every type of music almost. And I certainly use loops, even in things that don't sound like there are loops there. It's built on that culture, Acid Pro. It introduced time-stretching loops in real time, which, wow, right? Being able to stretch those loops into slower or faster and still use them, and then for them to not degrade, huge development. Also drag and drop production. So it was one of the first, or if not the first, where you could take a plugin or a WAV file, drag it in, drop it into a track, you use it. And that was huge. Getting into the 2000s, that's when DAWs went mainstream. As I said in the main episode, it was the home studio explosion. And the dominant one was, of course, Pro Tools. Still, again, the industry standard. As I mentioned before, it defined the professional studio workflow. A lot of people, if you mention DAW and they know anything about DAWs, that's the first one they mention is Pro Tools. And it refined in the 2000s editing precision, large session mixing. That was partly because computers couldn't allow for that. There were times, even until very recently, where if I had too many tracks going, my processor, my CPU, couldn't handle it. I'd have to freeze tracks. I'd have to split up into two sessions, whatever. The more powerful computers got, the more you were able to have larger sessions. But that all started with Pro Tools. And, of course, Ableton Live. Debuted in 2001. It's now on its 12th iteration. I'm still using 8 for many reasons, which I mentioned in some other episode. It was a major conceptual break because it was not just designed for production, it was designed for live performances. In fact, a lot of people who hear Ableton to this day say, oh, isn't that DJ one? Which is where it started, really, because my production partner in The Drop, Daniel, was also a DJ and loved that type of music, still does that kind of music, more or less. And that's how he got turned on to Ableton. Used it for a lot of his live sessions when he was DJing, frankly, and then used it at home to record, translated it to me, and I never looked back. It has a non-linear session view, which is, again, horizontal is the best way to record and mix. You can do all your editing in there. But when you want to either DJ or which allows you to kind of trigger loops and things like that, go vertical, It's built on loop culture, electronic music, again, as I mentioned, but has expanded so much beyond that I don't even consider that anymore. It shifted DAWs from recording tools to instruments. It is an instrument for me. It is absolutely an instrument for me. And as I mentioned, Fruity Loops, FL Studio, started in the 1990s but exploded in the 2000s. Pattern-based sequencing, very popular in hip-hop and EDM. Built on step sequencers, fast beat creation workflow, minimal barrier to entry, meaning I knew a guy, sadly passed away a few years ago, in an old job that I worked, who was not a musician, but still liked recording his ideas. What he used? Fruity Loops. It was easy to use. Logic Pro, which was an Apple acquisition in 2002, became more integrated and streamlined. Was built on Logic's MIDI heritage. It introduced it was the all-in-one production suite for Mac users. Now, I've never owned a Mac, but I had Logic because they also made it. I forget, was it that they made it or I had an ability? I don't remember, but I had Logic for a while in the early 2000s. But then 2004 GarageBand. Talk about barrier for entry being low. This was a simplified DAW for mass users. It was built on Logic's engine, but greatly simplified, very beginner-friendly. There are a few songs on the Weird Objective in which I pulled old recordings from an iPad that I had made in GarageBand and then used them in Ableton and created the full song from them. And that just, GarageBand has created, whether it's on Macs or iPads or probably phones, for all I know, some mega selling hit songs. And the barrier for entry, we want barrier for entry for everything to be that low, even if you do need a learning curve for some of the more complex. 2010s, the DAWs mature. They democratize even more. Everything is accessible. Everything is integrated. Everything is in the box. To a degree, and I'll explain that a little bit later. The major platforms of the 2010s, again, Pro Tools, you just keep mentioning it. Logic is a mainstream songwriting powerhouse. Fruity Loops, FL Studio, hip hop and EDM, Ableton Live, electronic and experimental, and everything for me. And I do all kinds of music. Subsequently, spinning off from people who worked at Ableton was Bitwig in 2014, which still exists. I've always wanted to try it. Never quite got there. Reaper, I don't know when Reaper came about. I should have looked that up before, but I've used Reaper as well for something where I had to use that. Seems like a pretty cool thing. And again, that's low barrier for entry. A little more complex than GarageBand, but worth looking into. And a quick mention here of LMMS, Linux Multimedia Studio, open source, free. It came out in 2004, but didn't go cross-platform, non-Linux users, until 2014. So that's why I'm mentioning it here. It's built on the 2000s DAWs, which really was where DAWs came of age. It introduced high-quality stock plugins and cloud collaboration, which was a huge thing. I don't use it often, but it's huge for if you're working with somebody who doesn't live where you live, and you can use the same DAW for something like LMMS, and also has better CPU and efficiency, which is something I'm always looking for in every software I use. And again, the big shift here in the 2010s, and this was partly the shift in the 2000s, and I mentioned in the main episode, but really in the 2010s, and that is that you didn't need outboard gear to sound professional. I don't have the money, never did, never have since then, may someday, don't care, frankly, to buy all the outboard gear that I would need to make the songs that I create sound the way they do. But I can make them sound that way because of what you can use in DAWs. And they're affordable and often free if you know where to look. And then 2020s. DAWs are now just the ecosystems. That's it. They're no longer just software. They are platforms. They now have AI assisted mixing and mastering. Here's the thing. Whatever for AI, right? AI has been around a lot longer than we've been talking about it. And as with any tool, there are good and bad points. It's all in how you use it. It has existed for quite a while, and I'll tell you how I know. There are things you do in Ableton that are automated unless you don't want them to be, and those automations are intuiting things about your track. That's AI, and it works really well. You want to deny it and change something else or turn it off, fine. But the fact that it exists makes editing so much easier and makes things sound better. And now that's the standard, really. Big thing in the 20s, and certainly before in the 2010s, stem separation. Everybody talks about stems. They have been for a few years. And stems are what? They're just individual tracks recorded separately. So when you want somebody to remix your track, let's say you have 30 tracks, depending on what they ask for, you need to take and record each one of those individual tracks. Make sure you start at the beginning for each one or they won't line up. But those are stems, those individual tracks. Again, cloud collaboration, huge. Integrated distribution pipelines. So not only do you have CD Baby and TuneCore and DistroKid, you have all these other little mini ones popping up now, and I've used a couple of them, and they're fine. They're still working out the kinks, but you know what I'm saying. And all of this was built in the ecosystem of the 2000s and 2010s plugins. Plugins. My world would be empty without plugins, my recording world anyway. AI EQing is what I was talking about, and auto mixing, again, do that. See if you like it, and if you don't, then do it yourself or ask for tweaks. But the fact that you can auto mix or even more importantly, to my estimation, auto master things means if it works for you, you have a shortcut. And if you can tweak it even, that's still shorter than it would take for you to do it yourself. Or, and then if you don't like it, then you can just do it yourself. So DAWs are really acting like creative partners, not just tools, which they always have, but especially today. You can kind of think, to sum up, the evolution of DAWs in 4 phases. In the recording phase, from the 70s to 80s, the question was, can we store sound digitally? And they found a way to make that answer yes. In the 90s, it was the editing phase. Can we manipulate audio like text? Can we see it so that we can take the waveforms and copy and paste? Or if we look at a waveform of, like, let's say one vocal line and it's thinner, doesn't have the height on bottom or top, well, that's not loud enough. Just raise that one and make it louder to match the others. That visual editing really started to come about in the 90s. The 2000s, it was all about production. Can we build entire songs inside a computer, not just use the DAW as the interface through which you do your mixing, but you're doing the recording with outboard gear, etc., to do the whole thing in a DAW. And 2010s up to today, it's an ecosystem. Can this software help to co-create music, whether that means tiny little things like the automation I was talking about, or bigger things that are a point of controversy, which is actually creating loops for you and things like that, we continue to question whether or not that's originality. And again, it depends how you use it. If your entire song is that loop, unless you're kind of trying to be some kind of a postmodern performance artist thing, and the urinal, what's his name from Dada, then what great knowledge I have. Then really it's how you use it within the context of a greater song that matters, whether or not it was created by you. DAWs in the coming decades are likely to shift from being primarily tools for recording and arranging into fully interactive creative systems that actively participate in music making. If they come up with a DAW similar to Ableton that allows me to use all the plugins I have, which is not easy because some of them are really old, but including the new ones, and B, integrates this kind of AI that allows me to turn it on and off, sure, but does some automation for things like, can you intuit for me the best mix for this track, for this song? Do a pass for me, AI. Pan things where you think they should be panned based on the template of EDM or rock or hip hop or pop or whatever it is. Give me the volumes you think it should be, again, based on a certain aesthetic that you put in. Oh my God, I don't think I'd ever stop making music. Instead of only offering virtual instruments, editing lanes, and plugins, future DAWs will increasingly use this AI to generate musical ideas, suggest arrangements, like I just said, and even respond in real time to an artist's intent, which is sometimes good, sometimes annoying, whether that intent is harmonic, rhythmic, or purely emotional. So thinking that you could sing something and get close enough and it'll put it in tune for you while you're singing it, but still make it sound like your natural voice. We're already seeing early versions of this, especially in stem separation. When I do sync licensing and they want a different mix, then I have to create stems for that. Sometimes my old sessions don't exist or are hard to access. I would rather, and it would be much easier, to use a high-end program that separates that music into as many stems as you need, and that comes from AI. It's the same AI that allowed for the Beatles song Now and Then and all this stuff, and that entire Peter Jackson special, right? Smart mixing assistants, like I mentioned, helping you make mix decisions, doing it for you. Composition tools, that's fine. There were EDM type synths that became plugins eventually that would create a loop of a certain kind, and that would be used in the context of an original song. Nobody bitched about that, or if somebody did, so what? DAWs that understand context and reference an artist's evolving style is something we haven't gotten to yet. That's like 2030s probably. They help, in fact, plugging in an abstract idea and giving it instructions like make it feel open more ambient, make it feel more urgent, more aggressive, and then it does it for you. My God, that basically, again, it's taking jobs away from some people because that's basically like having either an engineer or producer. But for the people who can't afford to hire people, which I feel bad for both sides of that equation, it's good to have these, tools. Rather than replacing producers, though, these systems are likely to function more like collaborative partners with producers who have the know-how to know when the result of that AI is any good. You need a human to do that. Amplifying decision-making speed is where the real benefit comes in, and expanding creative possibility, which is what every step of the DAW and technology in music has done. Keep expanding that. And so the future then would less be studio in the box and more of an entirely responsive musical environment where machine intelligence is coupled with human intuition, and they work in tandem with each other to create something even better than it could have been. I mean, that's the optimistic view anyway. And I hate to say it, guys. And next week, I believe, my episode is going to talk about this phenomenon. But every time we think something's going to destroy the world, it just gets integrated and we move on. And that's going to be the case eventually with AI, after some growing pains, of course. And I am not diminishing those growing pains. But bottom line for this, Bonus MXTRA here on patreon.com/music is not a genre, which if you're listening elsewhere, please consider joining for as little as $1, is that DAWs are amazing, and there are plenty out there to choose from. Start with LMMS if you can't afford anything. I'm always going to recommend Ableton because I love it, but I know people who love, FL Studio, Fruity Loops. I know people who swear by Logic, who swear by Pro Tools. Find the one that works for you, even if it's GarageBand. GarageBand has some great stuff. And get started on creating the music that's inside of you. Thanks. Talk to you next week.